Well, my clock says 10:15, so good morning, everyone, and welcome to the SUNYLA session, Understanding and Reviewing E-Resource Accessibility. Our presenters today are Carli Spina, who is Head of Research and Instructional Services at the Fashion Institute of Technology and is a co-chair of the SUNY Library Accessibility Cohort. Michelle Eichelberger is the SUNY Library Services Discovery and E-Resources Program Manager and is very involved in the accessibility initiatives for SUNY. And Rebecca Oling has worked at Purchase College for 2 decades and is currently Interim Director of Digital Accessibility. She is also a co-chair of the SUNY Library Accessibility Cohort. And I should pause and ask, can everyone hear me okay? Okay. And a couple housekeeping notes. This session will be recorded and please stay muted unless invited to speak. And I'll be monitoring the chat for you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'll go ahead and get started. If you could advance the slide. So I'm Rebecca Oling at Purchase College. And one of the things that we were concerned about in bringing this group of people together is really understanding all of the different audiences that we serve with regard to accessibility. So in making this case for accessibility, we really need to think about who do we serve. And some of the answers are obvious and some of them are not so obvious. So obviously we serve students, faculty, and staff. I put some things here on this slide, but you can pop other things as you think of them into the chat and we'll share them. At Purchase College, we have a museum, so we also serve docents. We serve independent researchers, we serve community members, and we serve each other. But as I was sitting down to think of this, I thought I probably left out a lot of different audiences. Part of our community might be our family members, part of our community might be donors, visitors, adult learners. We're about to have a senior living center on our campus. So we serve a lot of different people. You can advance the slide. Thank you. Oh. Just go back one. There you go. So in library school, we all learned about Ranganathan's 5 laws of library science. And in prepping for this session, I was really thinking of what we attempt to achieve in bringing accessibility to the fore in our libraries. And I found this 5 Laws of Library Science remix from 2015 that I thought really spoke to what happens in the accessibility landscape. So knowledge is for use in all forms. Every citizen has the right to access all knowledge in all forms. So Ranganathan used to say, you know, every book its reader. Every piece of knowledge is for access by all without discrimination of any kind. Save the time of all knowledge seekers. And a library or knowledge system is one that evolves with time to achieve all of the above laws. So I really liked this. I thought that this is a nice way of contextualizing how the library world has tried to change and meet the needs of its users. You can move forward. So what are some of the challenges and issues with regard to e-resources? Historically, accessibility was not necessarily part of our selection process for most of our institutions. Some of our institutions may have had more students with disabilities coming to the fore and demanding access sooner than others, but we're going to see this trend increase as we see more and more people willing to identify and more people willing to say what it is that they need. Library databases, as we were looking at the overall landscape, even though they're really important to us as librarians, as part of the cohort, we did not look at library databases as the highest impact EIT. And it's important to kind of state that in the beginning so that we can contextualize it for all of us. Not every single student who graduates from our institutions has to use every single database, right? They all have to register for classes. They all have to go through the bursar's office. They all have certain tasks that they need to do, but not every student is going to use every single database. So that took a little pressure off of us in the cohort to look at the library databases in terms of accessibility without putting too much pressure on the group itself, because you'll see in a minute it was a very varied group of individuals. So not only did we have the challenge of many of our libraries having, in our library we have 172 different databases, but we had the challenge of most of the libraries being understaffed, right? We're perpetually given more to do with fewer resources. And so that's definitely always a challenge with regard to e-resources, even just the management of them, not accepting the fact that we now have to really look at the accessibility of these resources. But in looking at the e-resources and looking at accessibility, we know that this is one of our largest investments. And so to really be able to get a return on that investment, we need to look at accessibility. We need to make sure that more of our audience can actually use the resources. These needs were clear before COVID happened. At Purchase College, they added my position 3 years ago to focus specifically on accessibility and making sure that we were trying to meet the needs of our students. That work began 3 years ago with the idea that we would first look at the classes where we knew we had students that had disabilities and serve that audience first. But with the advent and use of Ally, we've been able to reach out to other audiences. So particularly places where we knew faculty were really scanning a lot of items and not attending to the accessibility issues that might be there, we were able to reach out to them with the use of Ally. The pandemic, when it hit, really accelerated this whole needs landscape, because now you had more and more faculty who were put in the position of not having preparation for this. Many of them were not as intimate with our e-resources as we would like them to be. And they lack the technology to adequately scan the items. So in the library, we have high-powered scanners. They can crop, they can do OCR, they can do a lot of accessibility features to make things more accessible. But when they were in their homes, when they were in their studio apartments, they didn't have that. So they really had to find the more e-resources, and they were working more closely with the librarians. And we hoped that that would be the case. It wasn't always the case. We had in the pandemic, limited ability for drop-in explanatory or light bulb moments, both with faculty and with students, right? Many of us moved to e-reference services. And so we tended in those instances to meander to those things that we were comfortable with or that we knew had more accessibility just from an anecdotal perspective. But in terms of faculty, they meander to those things that they were used to using, regardless of whether or not they were accessible. And then I think in the pandemic, we also had more and more of us having these sort of executive functioning challenges, being in more distracted environments, having issues with understanding the time management issues. Some people were forgetting what day it was, right? So we all had these kinds of issues. Attending to the accessibility of what we were doing were real challenges. So the cohort came together at this time of great change when the needs of accessibility were skyrocketing. You can go ahead and change the slide. So the great thing about SUNY systemness is that we're all together in this. The EIT policy was passed in 2019 in accordance with Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act and the ADA. And in that EIT policy, it stated that SUNY administration and campuses shall develop, purchase, host and or acquire to the extent feasible web pages, website, hardware, software products, and services that are accessible to persons with disabilities. So on an anecdotal level, we all as librarians understood this, but now this has become more a part of our policy. And again, how does that affect the library? Well, some things all of the students may need to use in terms of hardware and whatnot, and some of us are just beginning to look at that. But in terms of the databases, we like to think of those as sort of middle impact resources. You can move ahead. Great. So the SUNY system decided to establish this cohort in the summer of 2020, just as all of this stuff was hitting. And we had representatives from a wide variety of libraries, varied sizes, varied types, varied patron needs. We had representatives from Ulster Community College, Oswego, New Paltz, Stony Brook, FIT, Broome, Upstate, Monroe, OCC, Orange County. So I'm probably missing some because there was some flow in terms of the membership of the cohort. But one of the things that we recognized was that there were very few people who were coming together as part of this cohort who had any real expertise. We had to create a kind of community of practice, if you would, where we shared resources that we each found helpful in learning about accessibility and brought in at times speakers, tutorials, and whatnot so that we could teach ourselves what we needed to know in order to look at our e-resources with this lens. Members of the cohort had a variety of roles on their campuses. We had people who were head of special collections, information literacy coordinators, distance ed librarians, web services, access services. There were very few members who were deeply ensconced in the accessibility landscape. So we all had a lot of patience with that as a community. But the one thing that we all shared was that we arrived invested. Every single member had an interest in the work, whether it was a genuine interest in accessibility itself or an interest in the fact that this is on my plate and I need to get it done and I'm going to need help doing it, which was that sort of SUNY systemness that we benefit from. So we all had varied levels of experience and comfort with accessibility reviews. We shared the same goal of self-directed training, and we built a community together. And in that community, one of the things that Carli, my co-chair who will speak in a minute, and I recognized was that everybody's plates were extremely full. And soon into the cohort, we realized we couldn't give people a ton of homework in between meetings. They already had a lot of things on their plates. So we created some generic rules around for ourselves around what we would assign for cohort work in between meetings. And I think we agreed like on a half an hour so that it wouldn't be too taxing. And we tasked people as they learned about accessibility and about doing reviews. We worked together to create forms, which Michelle will talk about in a little bit, that would make it a little bit easier and walk people through the reviews. And we tasked each other with reviewing VPATs for e-resources subscribed to by SUNY campuses. So rather than the 172 databases that I might have on my campus, what the system did was they went ahead and the SLS looked at, okay, which databases are common to all the campuses, and let's start with those first. And that's how we created our goal of looking at about 80 databases. And that would, in essence, take a lot of work off of each person's shoulders so that we wouldn't have to duplicate that effort at every single campus. So part of what we did was we created this model documentation. We created a toolkit with vendor communications and with information on how to better collaborate to look at e-resources. And Carli and Michelle will talk a little bit about that.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk next about VPATs. Hopefully everybody can hear me. And let's start by talking about what a VPAT is and what that stands for. So VPAT stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. And it's basically a way of taking any sort of software or database or online product and evaluating its accessibility using this template. And there are actually 4 different versions of the template out there, because it can cover either US law, meaning US revised section 508. It can cover European law, which is EN 301549. Or there's a version that focuses on WCAG standards, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines that are developed by W3C and are sort of the standard that a lot of laws across a lot of countries look at. There's also what's called the INT version, and that covers all 3 of these. Typically, you will see variation, but a lot of times I see that vendors use either the one that covers all 3 or the WCAG one, because that is something that is generally pretty standardized, that a lot of countries do use WCAG guidelines. And basically, we're going to look at an example, but basically the template walks you through whichever of these you're using, the pieces of that particular standard, and considering whether or not the product that is the subject of the template, whether or not it meets the standards that are set by that particular document. Generally, these are created by the vendor regarding their individual products. So there's a couple of things to take away from that statement. First of all, it is generally something that the vendor would be creating, but there's no reason that someone else, some third party, couldn't take the Voluntary Product Accessibility Template, or VPAT, and apply that template to another product. It's just typical that vendors will provide these. Not all do, certainly, but a lot do. And when I say individual products, this can vary a bit vendor to vendor. Basically, if a vendor has a single platform and multiple products are offered on that platform, because the technical piece of it is the same, sometimes they will just offer a single VPAT that applies across all of them. But in many times, a vendor that offers multiple databases will actually have different VPATs that are specific to different products. Same with people who offer software. So let's look at an example of a VPAT. This is one that's publicly posted. That is one thing to be aware of when you're talking about VPATs. Some people have them publicly posted on their websites. Some people are fine with sharing it and then having whatever library they've shared it with post it publicly. And some vendors prefer that it be kept private. So this one I found publicly available online. It's from ArtStore, a database that many of us may have heard of. And I just want to talk a little bit about what we can tell about this. So first of all, you'll see that the template does say what version it's based on. And up at the top here, you'll see that it says ArtStore Digital Library Accessibility Conformance Report. So technically, VPAT refers to the template. And once you've used the template, you create something called an Accessibility Conformance Report. In reality, a lot of people refer to the final document once it's been used. So this document that we're looking at here, a lot of people will colloquially refer to that as a VPAT still. And that's how I'm going to be using the term VPAT to mean both the template and the finished product. But you may sometimes see it referred to as an accessibility conformance report. So it's worth knowing that that is also correct and that those two things can be used a lot of times synonymously. So you'll see here that they're talking about how the product that's being covered here is both the ArtStore Digital Library and the ArtStore platform. They give you a little bit of a description of it. Often this will just sort of be a one-liner. And then an important thing to keep in mind is that they're going to have here when this was created. This is important because it allows you to determine sort of what you want your practice to be, whether or not you want to ask for an updated VPAT on a regular schedule, whether you just want to ask for it when there are major changes to the platform, whatever your decision around that is. And we can talk a little bit about sort of what our decision-making process was, which was that we generally didn't come up with something that we said every library should do, but we did sort of think that it was important to be making sure that this VPAT refers to the most up-to-date version of the platform if there have been any major changes to functionality. Another important piece of this is the contact information. Sometimes this will be a generic support email address as here, but sometimes it will be a specific contact for accessibility issues. And we're going to talk later on about the fact that we also recommend tracking and reporting accessibility issues to the vendor. So knowing who the contact is here can be very valuable in determining who best to send those issues to. And then you'll see that this notes field often will give you a bit of their methodology. So how did they do this evaluation? Did they outsource it? Do they have a statement as is here that ArtStore does not fully conform to WCAG 2.1 level AA, but would fully conform if the non-conforming contributed content were removed from the analysis? So that's what, those sorts of statements give you like a quick overview of what you're going to see throughout the document. And these documents are quite long. As you can see here, it says that it's 31 pages in total. So let's take a quick look at why it's so long by looking at just one example page or one example criteria. So the way that the rest of the template looks is like this. It's going to take each criteria or element of the standard, in this case, the WCAG standard. It's going to state what that criteria is, and then it's going to state their conformance level, which is either going to be that it fully conforms, it partially supports it, or it does not conform. The exact way that's worded might differ from report to report, but it's going to basically be giving you that level of information. It's not going to necessarily give you a percentage. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen someone give a percentage of conformance. It's not going to necessarily go into a great deal of depth in this column. It's really just going to be a summary, fully supports, partially, or does not. And then in the remarks and explanations, hopefully they're going to give you a lot more detail. And this is one way that you can evaluate the VPATs that you're looking at for sort of detail and quality, because sometimes you'll receive a VPAT and there will be nothing in any of the remarks and explanations column, even though it says that it's only partially supporting some things or even doesn't support some things. They still leave out all remarks and explanations. Sometimes they'll just have copied and pasted what's obviously the same language over and over again. Sometimes if you're looking at a VPAT that refers to multiple platforms, it won't really be clear which platforms the remarks and explanations refer to. So when you receive a VPAT and you're reading through it, I think it's very useful to look at these remarks and explanations very carefully as part of determining whether or not you think the VPAT is at the level that you would need it to be to sort of be acceptable. So you can always go back to a vendor with follow-up questions based on the VPAT. You could always ask them to provide a more detailed one if you do receive one that's very much blank. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the vendor communication piece towards the end, but that toolkit that Rebecca mentioned does include with it some model documentation, and we're adding more all the time about how to get in touch with vendors and even exact language that you can use or modify for asking for this sort of information, for asking for more detail, for asking for a timeline to a fix, those sorts of things. Now, when we're looking at this, you'll see that they also are going to talk about how they did this evaluation, if this is a really good remarks and explanation. So that's part of why this is a pretty good example of it. So you'll see that it starts off by saying that all meaningful images that are part of the ArtStore interface have a text alternative. So that's excellent. And then they talk about how they evaluated this. And they used voiceover for it. So that's something that you could then think about whether that seems like a reasonable way, whether your users maybe mostly use another tool that you would also want to test with. Those sorts of things are what can be really useful in these remarks and explanations, the real methodology of how they've looked into the information. So what does a VPAT do now that we've taken a little bit more of a look at one? Well, first of all, I would say that it demonstrates that a vendor has considered accessibility and tested regarding the common accessibility standards and legal requirements, or at least the requirements within some jurisdictions. This might seem like a very basic statement, but unfortunately, the truth is that we're still at a point where not all vendors really are considering accessibility or testing for it, or at least not to the standard that we might think is necessary based on our obligations. So I think that this sort of basic level of just they've demonstrated that they've done this is an important one. having a VPAT does demonstrate that vendors are thinking about accessibility in a certain way. Particularly if it's a well-completed one. Sometimes you'll have VPATs that aren't very well completed, and then it might not really be a good demonstration that they are considering this, but it gives you a sense of how they're considering accessibility. Next, it provides an understanding of known issues. Sometimes they'll offer proposed workarounds, but even if they don't, knowing what the issues are can help in planning for how are you going to provide meaningful alternative access for students who need it and other patrons who need it. It serves as a guide for discussing accessibility issues with the vendor and planning for accommodations. So if they say that there is an issue, it can definitely open up a conversation. Well, what's your timeline for fixing that issue? How are you addressing it? Why is that issue present? Is there some concern that you have about meeting that criteria because sometimes meeting one criteria might actually make a product less accessible for someone else. So this can be a good opportunity to have these sorts of discussions with the vendor. And it may include statements already about when improvements will be made, which is helpful to know and can also help when you're then the next year renewing. You can go back to looking at what improvements were supposed to be made and see if they have been, if not, get an update on when they might be. What does a VPAT not do? I think it's equally important to know that VPATs aren't going to fix all of your accessibility problems overnight. They don't guarantee that testing has been done accurately and comprehensively. The more you know about the methodology, the more you can test that and the more confidence I think you can have. But there's a lot of literature that suggests that in reality, VPATs are not completely accurate. And in fact, some of the research that's out there has shown that a majority of them do have some significant issues, though that research was done a few years ago at this point, so I can't state whether that would still be the case. But there is a lot to say that it's important to know that you can't be guaranteed that this is absolutely accurate and comprehensive. It also doesn't guarantee that all accessibility issues have been properly addressed or appropriately addressed. If a VPAT identifies an issue, that doesn't necessarily mean that the vendor has started working on fixing that issue, has any plan to fix that issue, is able to fix that issue. Sometimes they just put something on a VPAT and that might just be like the end of the process for them because it might be something that they feel they can't fix, that they aren't considering fixing at this time. So I think it's also important to know that just because they know about the issue doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be fixed in the near term. They don't serve as a legal warranty, at least not as far as I know. This isn't to say that it's sort of providing you with legal advice about it, but it's not something where you would want to be feeling that because you've gotten the VPAT, you don't have to worry about accessibility. We really have an obligation to make things accessible, both, I would say, just in terms of what's right to do, and also in terms of the laws that most, if not all, of the institutions here are subject to. And so it's important to know that this isn't a way around that, certainly, hopefully, obviously. It doesn't always get updated immediately or at all upon revision to the platform. This definitely varies a lot by vendor, but if somebody sends you a VPAT, it's important to take a look and make sure that it really is with respect to the version of the product that you're using, because sometimes it'll be several years old and you'll know that they made a major redesign in the interim. It doesn't address the needs of every possible patron with a disability. And I do think this is also an important thing that we need to think about differently, because sometimes people think, oh, it's WCAG compliant, so we're good to go. But WCAG is always under development because the people who have created the guidelines would tell you that it's not perfect. It doesn't meet the needs of every single person with every type of disability or who uses every technical setup. And so just because a VPAT shows that it meets everything, if there is such a VPAT, I mean, I think most products aren't perfect, but even if there is a VPAT out there that demonstrates that a product is perfectly in compliance with every aspect of WCAG, that doesn't mean that you should then tell a patron who comes to you and expresses that they have met a barrier, well, you couldn't possibly have because this is WCAG compliant. There are still going to be people who need assistance in using our resources. And a lot of times the VPAT itself doesn't provide clear workarounds for all possible needs or requests. I think that's something that the libraries really need to be thinking about for ourselves is well, how are we going to help patrons? If a issue is identified, we can start sort of thinking about what might we be able to do to help people if they encounter this issue. And the bottom line here, I think, is that even if a VPAT is provided, it's not one of these things where you can just sort of pop it into your files. It really makes sense to try to take a look at it, understand what it's telling you, and maybe even try to do some review and testing, as we'll talk about a little bit more coming up.
Great, thanks, Carly. So as Carly mentioned, the VPAT can be very extensive, and if you're trying to just come up with a high-level summary of it, we needed to come up with some criteria to help you look at it. The way the VPAT is completed can tell you a lot about the vendor and their commitment to accessibility. You know, if they've really done a good job, they've looked into it deeply, that makes you feel a little more confident that they care about accessibility, that they're going to keep working to make changes, to make things better for people. So as a group, we decided that we needed a way to kind of, again, get a top level overview of where the vendor is coming from. So when you're starting to look at the VPAT, Carly did mention a couple of these things already. Here are a few things to consider. You want to look at the currency, their commitment to accessibility, how thorough they are in their remarks. You know, if they say that something's only partially supported, that they give you information about what pieces are supported, what pieces aren't supported. You need to think about the level of support for the VPAT and the accuracy in how it was created. So you can go ahead, Carly. So as Carly mentioned, you know, when was the report published? Are you looking at something that was published 3 years ago and the vendor's site has gone through a major upgrade in the last year or so? The version of the VPAT can give you information in terms of, are they using an outdated version? You know, maybe it meets the criteria of the older WCAG standards, but it's not up to date on the newer ones. Does it say anything about their plans to produce a new report? That can be helpful. You know, they can say, we're planning to fix these things in spring of 2021 and we'll create a new VPAT after that. We found that if you have a VPAT that's older than 2 years, it's best to contact the vendor to see if they have a newer one or if they're going to be producing one, because that can be useful information. Some of them you can find online. A lot of the vendors have a platform where you can just get to the most current version of it. And in this accessibility toolkit and repository that we've been mentioning, if there is a web version, we've gone with that one. It's really helpful if the vendor makes that information publicly available. And as Carly mentioned, the currency of the VPAT can be an indication of a vendor's commitment to making their product accessible. You go ahead. So, you know, thinking about their commitment to accessibility, how can you tell if they're taking it seriously? Do they have a dedicated contact person, or do they have a contact person at all? Is there anybody that a patron could contact if they're having trouble getting to something, or if they report a problem to a librarian? Is there anyone who the librarian could contact to say, hey, you know, do you have a screen reader version of this article that we could give to our patron? Do they have an accessibility statement? You know, that can show what their plans are. You know, do they have a roadmap where the things that they've identified as problematic in the VPAT, if they have one, are they letting you know when that will be completed, what their plans are? There's a lot you can infer from the VPAT itself. You can go ahead. So how thorough are they? Do they provide full remarks? That art store example that Carly showed is great. I mean, it's got very thorough remarks. Some of the ones you look at them and they just say supports or doesn't support. And it's like, well, what does that mean? So are there enough remarks? Are they accurate? And does it look like they really reviewed the criteria? You know, how much time did they spend on this? How much did they really look into it? So go ahead. So the level of support, what I mean by that is how much of the platform is supported in terms of meeting the criteria, meeting the standards. There are various levels. Level A is the most important one. Level AA is a little less important, you know, still valuable. So where it says it does not support a standard, is this a reasonable thing? You know, if they're a site where they don't have any material that's AV and they say they don't have captions, well, that makes sense. They're not an audiovisual type of site. Or maybe they're primarily articles, but they only have a few videos, and you know, maybe it's reasonable that they might have extensive support and for captioning for those videos. The other thing to keep in mind with all of these VPATs is that there's a difference between the structure, the platform accessibility and the content accessibility. You know, we're dealing with these aggregator vendors for the most part. So a lot of times they're getting content from other places. So maybe the structure that's surrounding it. So that, you know, the EBSCO structure is great, but they are going to have a hard time controlling what's coming in. You know, if there was an article published 20 years ago and it's, you know, electronic now, but it doesn't have alt tags for the images because accessibility wasn't as well known and wasn't as much of an industry standard 20 years ago. So there's different things to think about when it comes to what they're able to support. So you can go ahead. So how accurate is it? What you want to do is you look at the VPAT itself, and it's good to trust what the vendor's saying, but you also want to verify it. So, you know, if they say that they're great, they have alt tags for everything, well, we decided as a group that that wasn't good enough for us. We also wanted to go out and do some manual testing of the site. And, you know, there are some tools that you can use to do pretty high level review of a platform, and you could use a wave tool and check and see, you know, well, they say they have alt tags for everything, but when I run the wave on this, I see that they have 300 missing alt text errors. So, you know, again, trust but verify. The other thing is sometimes if you get something that's a little outdated, maybe they've made changes or they've improved things. That's what you hope for, that things have not gotten worse. So it's a good idea to check and see how accurate things are. So you can go ahead. So as I mentioned, what you want to do is you want to verify the vendor's assertions. Hopefully they've done a good job, or if they outsourced it to somebody else to review for them, hopefully they do have accurate information in there, but you want to make sure. And when you're trying to pull together a 1 to 2 page report on something, we had to identify what were the highest priority areas in terms of what to review, because some of these can be, you know, 100 pages long, these VPATs, but not everything is of equal importance. So what we decided on, we pulled out some general areas of review. So images and text are very important, captions, audio descriptions and transcripts, adaptable. Can you get to the content through a variety of methods like screen readers, that kind of, you know, keyboard, access to the page. Distinguishable, is color alone used to imply information? That would be for things like a table. You know, if you show your results only by color instead of by numbers, that can be difficult for people who have color blindness issues. So these are the kinds of things we started to pull out. You can go ahead, Carli. So to be continued, we pulled out, I think there are 9 top level criteria that we pulled out. So how navigable is it? Does it support keyboard navigation? And what I mean by that is, can you tab through the page or use some kind of a tool to get through the page without actually using a mouse? Does the site contain flashing content that might trigger seizure? That's a problem. Is the site organized in a predictable way? If you're somebody who's coming to the site and you might have some cognitive issues, do the pages make sense? Do they use the same menus in all of the places? Do they look the same? Is it intuitive to navigate the site? And then input assistance. This is particularly important if you are using some kind of a screen reader or keyboard access to the site. Are the forms coded correctly? If somebody who couldn't see the box and the label, would they be able to tell what was supposed to go in the fields? And then does the platform behave the same way on different browsers and a variety of devices? You know, if your only way to access the site is through your phone, will it shrink down enough? Does it have responsive design? Is it usable in multiple ways on different platforms? You can go ahead.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
So next up, we're going to talk about, so what if a VPAT isn't available or isn't complete? So sometimes vendors just don't have a VPAT still. And this is particularly the case for smaller vendors. I think a lot of the larger vendors do have them. I think it's also the case for a lot of vendors that maybe don't work as frequently with libraries or don't work as frequently, particularly with academic libraries, because I think academic libraries have been doing more work than some other libraries in some cases in asking for VPATs. So it is possible that you will find that they tell you we don't have a VPAT. It's also possible that you'll instead encounter them saying, oh, sure, we have a VPAT. And then what they send you is a really old version. It's almost blank. It, like Michelle was saying, maybe it really doesn't, it just says sort of like supports, but it says that for everything and offers no other details. and which I think is immediately something that maybe makes you a little bit question exactly how useful that is. So I think one thing is it's really useful to have a policy for next steps. And I don't necessarily mean that you need to have something very formally written out. But what I mean by that is I think it's good to have sort of a just standard response so that you're doing it the same for every single vendor. So you would just have maybe, for example, maybe you would say all VPATs, if it's older than 2 years, you're going to ask for a new one. Maybe you would say anybody who says that they aren't able to give you one, you're going to ask them to have one ready by the next time you renew. And maybe they won't, but at least you're going to ask for it. For everybody who sends you one that isn't complete, maybe you're going to send them a response. And just having those sort of steps in place, I think can make it a more streamlined process and less of a decision that you have to make every single time. And again, the toolkit's really helpful, I think, for this because we have a lot of these emails that you might need to send people written out. And I think it's a really good place to consider this an opportunity for vendor advocacy. When we were writing these model documents on the toolkit, we really were trying to explain why you're requesting a VPAT. We even share a link to the model VPAT that is available online. If they won't provide a VPAT or can't provide a VPAT, offer them an alternative. So ask them for their accessibility roadmap or for somebody that you can contact to talk about accessibility in their development team. I think you can also ask for a timeline to provide a VPAT. So maybe they say they can't provide one right now, but you can say to them, okay, well, when might you be able to provide one? So here's some model language that we developed, again, that's shared on this public toolkit, and we'll be sharing the link for that. Which is basically telling the person that you're writing to ask for a VPAT. It tells a little bit about what a VPAT does. It states that this is part of SUNY's commitment to providing equitable access, and that this is really tied to us understanding this when we're making our procurement decisions. This sort of tells them why it's important to us, and it also I think maybe we'll add a little bit of urgency for them because they understand that it's tied up with how we make procurement decisions, but it also, for those who may not have heard of a VPAT, gives them a little bit of context for the request. So then what if the VPAT isn't available or isn't complete once you send this email? Well, I think one thing you can do is check whether another library or organization has already completed a review. There are a couple of libraries and institutions that have been sharing their work online. One of these is the Library Accessibility Alliance. That's the name for it, Library Accessibility Alliance. And they basically have been employing a vendor to do reviews of products and then offering the company that created the product an opportunity to respond to those independent reviews of their products. So they can be a really great resource to go and check and see whether they've already evaluated the e-resource recently, because that gives you a really good sense of a professional look at whether or not they're accessible. I think you should also consider undertaking your own testing with patrons or using automated tools. Now, I know a lot of libraries take the automated tools route, and that's what we did as part of the cohort, but I do want to also mention the idea of testing with patrons. Libraries are doing more and more user experience testing, but I think sometimes we aren't thinking about who we're including in that user experience testing and making sure that we're equitably reaching all of our users. And I think one group that's often not a group that we really do a lot of outreach to about getting them involved with user testing is users who use assistive devices and who have disabilities. So I would think that that's a really good way that you could expand your library's user experience work, if you have any, is to start trying to work with users who use these assistive devices or who need accessibility features so that you can understand their needs and have someone who's really familiar with navigating these resources, using these tools, take a look at the tools with you. I would also say that it's important to share testing results and any accessibility complaints that you receive from patrons with the vendor. So I think having a system for collecting issues and tracking them so that you can then report them to the vendor is really great. And I think when you do, you can definitely ask for a plan for resolution or workaround. So this is some model language that we came up when the VPAT is not available. We talk about how it's increasingly the standard in higher education. And we say that we just aren't able to rely on their accessibility without documentation. And then we say that we would like to have their roadmap for future accessibility improvements instead, if that's all they're able to provide. Then we also have a form for model language for reporting any issues that do arise, and asking them to provide workarounds and a timeline for addressing the issue. We've talked a lot about resources in this session, so I just want to finish up by mentioning some of these resources. And we will be sharing these slides, and they have direct links to all of this information. So the Library Procurement Accessibility Toolkit is what we've mentioned throughout. This was created by the SUNY Library Accessibility Cohort. It's publicly available to anyone, SUNY or not, and it has these resources, the forms for doing database evaluations, and the model documents that we've been talking about during this session. The SUNY Library Vendor Accessibility Repository, members of the SUNY community can contact any of us for the password for full access to this. And it does have accessibility information available. The Library Accessibility Alliance, they have their Library Accessibility Toolkit, which has e-testing reports that I mentioned, and also has model contract language for those of you who are thinking about how you can work accessibility into contracts with vendors. UW Libraries also has an e-resource accessibility testing resource that they've shared, and that's really useful. And then CUNY has an accessibility and licensing at CUNY page that talks about VPATs and shares a lot of them, offers guidelines and more information. We also mentioned that we do testing using testing tools. The tools that many of us used were WebAIM's Wave, which is both free and web-based and browser-based options. DQ's Axe, which is a Chrome extension and also free. Patch Yellow's color contrast checker, and PEAT, which is the photosensitive epilepsy analysis tool. And it's only for Windows, but it helps to identify if there are seizure risks in web content and software. There are a lot of other tools you can also use. We mentioned that VoiceOver appeared in that art store documentation that is built into all iOS devices and Mac computers. For PCs, JAWS is the best known screen reader, but it's very expensive. And there's also another one called NVDA that is free and open source. And there's also Microsoft Narrator that's built into Microsoft products. So there's a lot of options out there that are free screen readers for people who want to do screen reader testing as well.
I put the link for NVDA in the chat.
Great. Did you put the link for the slides in by any chance?
No, but I can.
That'd be great. Thanks. I don't want to close them to get to the link. Okay. Does anybody have any questions? I see that we got a lot of comments, so I'm going to try to go back through, but.
I think they've all been addressed.
Okay.
Michelle was very quick, and Rebecca shared some helpful links as well.
That was a lot of information in a short period of time.
Yeah, if anybody does have any follow-up questions after this, they can also contact us. I'll put my...
and I would say that the cohort is going to continue in a more relaxed way. What we're going to be doing is having specific topics that will possibly be of interest to you, and we'll send all of that information around. So we know, for example, ebooks will be one of the topics that we cover. And Carly, I think because I'm not owner of the presentation, if I change permission to view only on the share link, it is going to knock me out.
Well, I think it'll knock you out when I do it too, but I can just stop sharing my screen then and do it.
Yeah. Thank you, Susan. Just glad we're continuing the work. Yeah, so it's not easy work. It's very vulnerable work, actually, because as I said, a lot of us are not experts in this. And I would suggest pairing up with people. It's one of the things that we did to create sort of and build that sense of community amongst ourselves. So consider finding other people that you can do it with. And most of the people in the cohort are happy to talk to you about that, I'm sure.
So there's the slides.
Oh, thank you. And you can email any of us for the password as well.
And I'm just going to go back to screen sharing because here are all of our email addresses.
Yeah, and we should probably address why we have it passworded. You know, our vendor relations are really important, so we didn't want this to be a public tool that was out there and have vendors possibly see things that we say that might be critical of their products. And you know, we're all still renegotiating our databases and our costs. So feel free to contact any of us if you need the password for that.
Okay, so I see there's a question. Do you have any expert tips to give to people who would just be starting this work at their campus, lessons you've learned, or things you wish you knew? I think I would say that one of the things is just that it's going to take time. So I think being realistic about the fact that it's going to take time. And when I work with people on accessibility stuff, not just this, but in general, I think a lot of times it can feel overwhelming and that can make it hard to get started. So I just always recommend to everyone to just focus on the fact that any work you do is helping to make an improvement, and no one's an expert overnight. So we hope that the toolkit will make it a little bit easier. And I would say starting with that, we're also trying to work still on some advice specifically for this, people who are just getting started. But I think just for me, at least, focusing on small manageable steps is a good way to make sure that you don't just get overwhelmed or give up, I would say.
Yeah, and the forms, I think the forms that we created, did we ever move those over to another format?
I think they're on the toolkit.
Yeah. So so that can really walk you through a little bit at a time. And you know, share your review with someone who may have a little bit more expertise. And I mean, I think we will continue to collect the work of at least the cohort members, and I'm sure if you have a particular database on your campus that might be of interest to others, I'm sure the cohort will accept outside, you know, reviews, conformance reports, and so we'll review those as well. And that's what we did as cohort members, was we did a conformance report and then sent it up the chain, and to SLS staffers looked at it and evaluated those and maybe made comments and sent it back to us. And that's just a learning curve for everybody.
Yeah, and I think you can always email any of us with specific questions as you're doing it too. So you don't have to feel like you just have to do it by yourself. There's other people at SUNY who are working on accessibility, and I think we all just need to work together. If you're on Workplace, I know that there's an open accessibility channel. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but area, space.
Yeah, let me see if I can get it's the SUNY Library Accessibility Group.
Thank you all for attending. If anybody does have any questions they think of after this, do feel free to email any of us. we're definitely happy to talk more about it. And the cohort is going to work going forward, but we're going to be focusing on other topics, I think, as well. So if there are any accessibility topics other than VPATs that you have a lot of questions about, I think we'd be really interested in hearing that, and feel free to pass along that information as well.
I just put the link in for the SUNY Library's accessibility workplace group.